Day 24th September is a further day in Ukraine's unending offensive. It began on the 4th of June, and if you look at a map, you find that the territory that's been contested or captured by Ukraine remains extremely limited, and essentially the fighting continues to take place in the same places where it's been raging ever since the beginning of the offensive in June. The Russian Defense Ministry says that Ukraine has lost a further 1,700 plus men, dead and wounded, over the course of the last week. I'm not remotely in a position to verify that number. It also claims that Ukraine has lost large amounts of equipment, including 16 tanks. There was a report yesterday that 2 Leopard 2 tanks were destroyed by the Russians in the Kupiansk area. And in fact, we're now seeing Western armoured vehicles, Leopard 2s, Bradleys, appearing in all sorts of places, not just in the main point of attack, which is, of course, continues to be, if you believe the Western media at least, the Orechov sector. To my mind, the fact that Ukraine is sending its tanks, even its valuable Western tanks, which are in increasing short supply, to plug holes in all sorts of places like Kupiansk, far in the north, far away from the fighting at Zaporozhye, speaks of a depletion in Ukraine's armoured forces. And in fact, there was an article in the Washington Post which essentially admitted that there'd been heavy losses by Ukraine of Striker armoured personnel carriers and Marders. I will come back to this shortly. There's also been another article, by the way, in the Washington Post that talks about heavy losses of Ukrainian helicopters. The Ukraine is now apparently critically short of helicopters, and perhaps more importantly, more significantly, of the crews to man these helicopters. And of course, what they're talking about is the MiL-17s, the Mi-17s, which were supplied by the United States last year. Ukraine has run through most of those, apparently. It had already seen a significant depletion of its Mi-8 fleet. These were leftovers from the Soviet era. It also has attempted to operate and has operated on quite a significant scale Mi-24 helicopter gunships, also left over from the Soviet Union, and apparently it appears to have run through most of these. But I can't help but think that this report about Ukraine being now short of helicopters is going to precede demands from Ukraine for Apache helicopter gunships to be supplied, along with all the other equipment that Ukraine has been demanding and so far getting. Now, I say all of this, there's been some quibbling about the ATACMS delivery. There's been still no announcement about the ATACMS delivery from the United States, no official announcement. Yesterday, the White House spokesman appeared to play down the prospect of an ATACMS delivery. I understand, and I'm confident that one will indeed take place. And the word is that 50 ATACMS missiles are going to be supplied to Ukraine, and that Germany soon after will announce the delivery of a total of 100 Taurus missiles in 2 batches. So Ukraine is going to get more missiles. And of course, it continues to lob missiles, not just, it should be said, Western supplied missiles, but its own Neptune anti-ship missiles, which is converted to some kind of land attack purpose, something which, by the way, It's not the first to do. The Russians do the same as well. Anyway, it's been continuing to launch its missiles now, principally at Crimea, principally at Sevastopol. There was another report yesterday of another Ukrainian missile strike on Sevastopol. This time, supposedly, it was mainly Neptune missiles that were used. The Russians imply that all of the missiles were shot down. There have been some reports that say that 2 did get through and did some damage to a naval shipyard where ships of the Black Sea Fleet are being decommissioned. There's no word to that effect from the Russians. There's no official confirmation. And I have to say, I think that's unlikely. When Ukrainian missiles do get through and do exact damage, one gets a lot more reports that tend to bear out these sort of claims from the Russian side. But anyway, I say that, obviously, I'm not on the ground. I don't have a huge amount of information about what goes on there. I've certainly not got any on-the-spot information about what's going on in Sevastopol. So I will just say that there are what appear to be conflicting claims about this particular missile strike and leave it at that. Overall, and I reiterate again what I have said previously on other occasions, none of these missile strikes, none of these drone attacks that Ukraine has been launching against Crimea, and which, to be clear, the delivery of Taurus and ATACMS missiles is intended to supplement, are going to make any fundamental difference to the cause of the conflict. I suspect that over time, Russian air defenses around Sevastopol will become increasingly hardened as they have become in other places. The Russians will gradually get to understand better the operation of some of these missiles, the Neptunes, the British Storm Shadow missiles, of which they have an almost intact example, which they are apparently unpacking and coming to understand. The French Scalp missiles, which are very similar to the Storm Shadows, but slightly different. The German Taurus missiles, and of course the ATACMS. And I suspect that at some point over the next few weeks, we will start to see the effectiveness of these missile attacks begin to diminish, just as we saw the effectiveness of the HIMARS missiles also diminish, and of the drone attacks which Ukraine has been launching or attempting to launch deep into Russia. In fact, in terms of the Storm Shadow missiles, I would argue that their effectiveness has already diminished significantly. When the Storm Shadows were first introduced and first used, they were able to penetrate Russian defenses. Apparently, the Russians were only succeeding in shooting down a small proportion of these missiles. By all accounts, that proportion has increased. In the missile strike that took place against Russia's Black Sea headquarters, the Russians claimed that they shot down 5 out of 6 missiles. And by the way, I haven't seen that claim contradicted, and the damage that was done to the building is consistent with only 1 missile having struck it. Now, on that missile strike, I'm just going to repeat what I've said before. It was an exercise in wastefulness and, more than anything else, a public relations exercise. The Ukrainians claim that there was an important meeting taking place in that headquarters when it was attacked, and that dozens of people were killed. The Russians sort of say that perhaps 1 person was killed. That's the official number. May have been more. But there are Russian reports now, not from the Defense Ministry, but from Russian sources, that suggest that the building was actually empty. And I am strongly inclined to believe this. This is, from the look of it, a relatively old building. I don't know when it was built. I think it is most unlikely that this facility is a military headquarters in a time of war when Sevastopol is under missile attack. The Russians surely would have relocated their command staff to safer buildings. And from what I've heard about Crimea, it is riddled with bunkers and other command positions and command posts. And I'm sure that this is true. And I have no doubt at all that, in fact, the Russian accounts that, as I said, this building was mainly empty, that this is correct. Anyway, that's one quick overview of the situation on the battlefronts. Let me repeat once more. So far, no reports that I can see of any breakthrough by Ukraine. Fighting in the Rabotino-Verbovoye area continues. The Ukrainians continue to make attempts to break through to Verbovoye and to other places to the southwest, to the southeast of Rabotino. But I've seen no sign so far that they've managed to achieve that. Now, there's an article in the Washington Post. I haven't read it, but from what I understand, from the summaries of it that I have seen, it basically says that the Ukrainians have managed to breach the Surovikin line significantly in the Verbovoye sector, that their tanks and armored vehicles, their strikers and their Marders are now beyond the Dragon's Teeth, and that they are closer, therefore, to achieving a breakthrough in the Rabotino-Verbovoye sector. And there are also claims, which appear from time to time, that Ukrainian armored vehicles have been geolocated to various places beyond the Surovikin line. I have to say that I've seen lots of Russian reports from all the usual sites that have covered the war. They have been busy debunking these claims, including the geolocation claims. These people who give these reports have tended to be reliable. The Russian Defense Ministry, for what it's worth, also appears in its reports about the fighting in the Rabotino-Verbovoye sector to speak about Russian lines holding in this area. And I have to say, I place greater reliance on these Russian reports than I do on what I suspect are Ukrainian ones and reports that ultimately originate from Ukraine, but which have been repackaged by the Institute for the Study of War and such entities. And one thing, it seems to me, is quite clear, that Verbovoye itself remains under Russian control. The Russians still have a presence in the southern outskirts of Rabotino. This tiny village has not been fully captured by Ukraine. It seems to me the true story of the fighting in this area is that the Ukrainians have been making attempts to capture Verbovoye, but have so far been unsuccessful. They've been making attempts to push the Russians off the heights in some of these places, but with very limited success, if any at all. And overall, the situation remains much as it has been now for several weeks. In other words, a situation of general stasis. Remember, those first claims of a Ukrainian breakthrough were made at the end of August. We're now approaching the end of September. If there had been a Ukrainian breakthrough in this area by the end of August, surely we would have had more manifestations, more positive manifestations of this. Now, I will make one caveat, going back to what Yevgeny Belitsky and Vladimir Rogov said. It does look as if the Ukrainians are gathering forces in this area. It looks as if they are planning to make more assaults in this area. There might be one big last attempt to try to push through in this area of Verbovoye, Rottino, and south of Orechov. Whether that succeeds or not, we shall have to see. But I reiterate again, I don't really see any real sign myself of any Ukrainian breakthrough of any significance, certainly none through the Surovikin line or towards Verbovoye up to this point. Elsewhere, things seem to have quietened down in the Bakhmut sector. Fighting at Klishayevka and Andreevka seems to have subsided. In fact, there are some reports that the Russians have counterattacked in this area, and the Russians appear to have made some kind of advance, some kind of push north of Bakhmut. And there was even a report yesterday, which the Russians, by the way, have since retracted, that they'd captured the village of Orekhovo-Vasilyevka, though it seems, according to the very latest Russian reports, that they have indeed managed to achieve some kind of a presence in this village. Anyway, the other axis of Ukrainian advance, the Vremevka salient, with the redeployment of Ukrainian troops from there to try to reinforce the Orechov sector. The Russians have been advancing, reoccupying lost ground, and they've been seeding their minefields again. They've been rebuilding or reconstituting their minefields, reversing whatever clearance the Ukrainians had achieved. There are multiple reliable reports that basically say this. This is not a Russian offensive in the Vremevka salient area, but they're once again taking the opportunity of the respite to strengthen, to reinforce their defenses. So, in the meantime, Russian build-up in the rear continues. I've discussed this at great length. Yesterday, Prime Minister Mishustin said that the budget, the military budget, the defense budget has been doubled. Overall spending is going to increase next year by 25%, but the Russians anticipate a surplus, presumably on the back of rising oil prices and higher tax receipts from the domestic economy. Well, we'll see whether that is sustained. As I said, there are some claims that the increases in defense spending mean that defense spending now counts for 6% of GDP. If so, during a war, that is hardly unprecedented. It is affordable, and all the indications are that the Russian economy continues to surge and that increases in production of weapons continues. It does suggest, by the way, that whatever doubling there has been in arms production up to this point is going to double again next year. So, to give one example, the United States claims that, or at least there's been reports claiming that the Russians are now producing around 2 million shells a year. If there's going to be a doubling of arms production next year on the back of this big increase in the defense budget, then that would mean that next year the Russians would be producing 4 million shells a year. That's against the 1.2 million shells that the US now says it is hoping to be able to produce by 2025. Just saying. Now, of course, we don't know the exact figures. These are just extrapolations, guesses if you prefer. Let's wait and see what does actually happen. There is no doubt that a major build-up in Russia is taking place. and it looks increasingly to me as if Western aid, despite the deliveries of the missiles that I've spoken about, that is starting to dwindle. And can I perhaps also say that striking that the United States did not announce the ATACMS deliveries whilst President Zelensky was in Washington. I take, by the way, my own personal take on this article in the Washington Post is that the Ukrainians and their supporters in Washington have tried to put an optimistic spin on events in the Rottino Verbovoye area, principally in order to reinforce the administration's attempts to get more funding from Congress for Ukraine. Funding for the moment continues to run into many, many problems. But I also believe that President Zelenskys' promise, and apparently it was more than just a secret plan, it was a promise made to US senators and US other officials while in Washington, that he was intending to capture Bakhmut and 2 other cities, one of them presumably Tokmak, by the end of the year. And it's now confirmed that this is the timeline now, is the end of the year. I think more than anything else, this is really, again, about trying to coax more money and weapons out of the United States. And as I've said already, it had limited success. A very subdued meeting, a very subdued visit by Zelensky to Washington. It doesn't seem as if he got much of what he wanted. And of course, he went to Canada, and there, predictably, he got a warmer reception from the Trudeau government and from the very large and very influential Ukrainian community in Canada. But then things turned even worse for him, because on his way back, he visited Poland. And whilst in Poland, he gifted decorations to some Polish volunteers who have fought on the Ukrainian side in the conflict. But conspicuously, no Polish official met with him. None from the current government. It doesn't seem as if President Zelensky has many friends at the moment in Poland, at least within the government. And one way or another, it does look as if the romance between Poland and Ukraine has now turned severely sour. And it's no longer, it seems to me, just a question about grain exports through Poland. The Polish farmers apparently still feel very angry over that issue. But it seems as if President Zelensky's own comments about Poland, his government's decision to bring legal action at the World Trade Organization against Poland, all of that has turned a significant body of Polish opinion against him and against Ukraine. And that seems to be a major souring of relations between Ukraine and one of its key allies. So, there we are. That seems to me to be the overall state of the war. I would say that there is also another article, apparently in the New York Times, which apparently is also reiterating that the offensive is not going well, that Ukraine is not able to sustain its advance, that it's likely that Ukraine will have to stop the offensive before long because the Ukrainian army is exhausted and will need reconstitution. And besides, this autumn weather is going to close in before very long. Now, I'm trying to find this article. I haven't been successful. It's probably somewhere. I'm not always particularly good at finding articles of this nature. And I would qualify my description of this article by saying that just possibly it might be a somebody revisiting an art. I don't remember where I read about this article, but it could be that this article is actually one that was published some weeks ago that said essentially the same thing. But anyway, overall, a situation where the front lines are static. Ukraine's offensive still seems to be making no headway. We're now into the last week of September. In October, the weather becomes wetter, the ground becomes softer, despite the brave words from people like General Tarnavsky. It's unlikely that Ukraine will be able to sustain its offensive throughout the autumn. Its manpower losses have been enormous. Its equipment losses have been enormous. The Russians continue their missile strikes across Ukraine. There were more heavy missile strikes. In fact, I suspect that we're now at the early stages of a big Russian missile offensive. And these Ukrainian missile strikes on Crimea are not going to change anything about the course of the war. I will just conclude by this summary of the situation on the battlefields by saying that Ukraine's that the delivery to Ukraine of all of these missiles, of the ATACMS missiles, of the missiles, the Taurus missiles, all of that is consistent with what was set out in that article in The Economist, what I described as the neocon plan. Ukraine, after the autumn, goes onto the defensive. This idea of capturing towns, in recapturing towns from the Russians, Bakhmut and two others, is quietly dropped, but that the war continues in the form of a missile offensive across Ukraine, against Russia, maybe targeting Crimea specifically. And of course, beyond that, there is the further factor that there is this further talk, rather, of building up Ukraine's economy, reconstituting its industrial base despite the Russian missile attacks. And of course, I would reiterate again that this is also wildly far-fetched. And Eve Smith at Naked Capitalism has written what I consider to be the definitive article debunking this fantasy. But anyway, that is where we are. And I'm now going to turn to two very interesting articles. One is by Larry Johnson on his blog, Sonar 21, and the other is in the Financial Times, and it is about the growing rift between the West and India, with a particular strong feelings in the West now about Prime Minister Modi. Let me turn first to Larry Johnson. Larry Johnson says that there are indeed visible signs of cracks now appearing within the Washington elite. He says that there's more and more signs that sections of the intelligence community and perhaps the uniformed military in the Pentagon are becoming increasingly alarmed and dissatisfied with the situation. He says that the problem is that President Biden and his team are paying no attention to any of this, that they continue to wish to prosecute the war in Ukraine as before. And Larry Johnson cites a really, I thought, empty and cliche-ridden news conference by the President's National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, in which, in my opinion, he simply repeated all the old talking points that we've heard many, many times, and which really don't add anything much to the state of our understanding of what is happening, but which do, in truth, and this is Larry Johnson's point, they still suggest an unwillingness to accept the realities with respect to Ukraine. And Larry Johnson also quotes Seymour Hersh, who has had discussions with one of his sources, which is in effect saying the same thing, that there's growing amount of intelligence data being provided essentially to the administration, that the offensive is failing, that Ukraine's army is in a state of decay, that many units in Ukraine's army are no longer fighting, that soldiers are increasingly unwilling to fight. By the way, there have been lots of reports about this, but they've been coming mainly from Russian sources, so I've tended to avoid them myself. I can't verify to the extent to which they're true. But anyway, there's been lots of reports about. Anyway, this is what Larry Johnson and Seymour Hersh are saying, that the professionals in the intelligence community and in the Pentagon are becoming now not just skeptical about the war, but increasingly critical of it, but that the administration is refusing to listen, and they're pressing on, and they remain confident that in some form or other they will achieve whatever objective they still hope for or hanker for in Ukraine. Now, how does that fit in with the points that I've been making for some time now, that the administration, the ascendant part of the administration, is talking about some kind of a freeze of the conflict in Ukraine? I mean, on the face of it, what Larry Johnson and Seymour Hersh are saying flatly contradict that. I don't think it does exactly. I think that Jake Sullivan and perhaps Tony Blinken are in some way as disconnected from reality as the more hardline neocons, people like Victoria Nuland and others like her, continue to be, and perhaps as the president continues to be. Because even as the more hardline neocons propose what, in my opinion, is a completely unviable solution, the idea that Ukraine turns itself into some kind of armed camp or fortress, but fights the Russians to a standstill by launching missiles at Russia and drones at Russia in a presumably unending stream. Even as I find that view fantastical and unrealistic, I think that the proposal that the Sullivan Group have come up with for a freezing of the conflict is unrealistic as well. The Russians, as I've said many times, are dead set against it, and they are certain to reject it if it is ever formally put to them. And we now have conclusive evidence of the second, because Sergei Lavrov, who is Russia's foreign minister and who is representing Russia at the UN General Assembly, he's just been giving speeches and press conferences, and he said a most interesting thing. He said that yes, Russia is willing to sit down to talks, to negotiations, That's always been its position ever since the conflict began, not in 2022, but in 2014, that the Russians are always willing to sit down and talk and negotiate, and that they are prepared to sit down and negotiate now. But one thing that Russians will not agree to, and that is a ceasefire. As far as the Russians are concerned, they've been led up the garden path too many times. They've trusted Western and Ukrainian promises about ceasefires multiple times. There were ceasefires that were supposed to have been agreed as part of the so-called Normandy process, which I remember took place in the spring and summer of 2014, which the Ukrainians disregarded when they launched a major military offensive against the Donbass, which ended disastrously for them. There was another ceasefire, which was supposed to have been agreed in September 2014, Minsk 1, and that never really stuck, and the fighting resumed in January and February of 2015. There was the ceasefire that was supposed to have been agreed in February 2015, Minsk, as part of the Minsk II agreement. That too was never properly fulfilled. I appreciate that Ukraine's supporters in the West will say that it was the people they called the Russian-backed separatists in Donbass who were violating these ceasefires. But I have to say straightforwardly, I think the facts tell a completely different story. And of course, from Lavrov's point of view, and this he actually discussed and dwelt on at length, there was the debacle of the peace negotiations last year. The negotiations which took place first in Belarus, and then which led to what appeared to be a peace agreement, a draft peace agreement in Istanbul, one which both sides initialed, but which the Ukrainians walked away from, apparently at the urging of the United States and of Britain, but only after the Russians, according to Lavrov and other Russian officials, complied with the Ukrainian request to pull their troops back from Kiev. Again, I accept that Ukraine and in the West, there's a different account of what happened in Kiev. They assert that the Russians were driven back from Kiev by the Ukrainian military. Again, I don't think the facts really are in accord with this, but I'm not going to argue the point in this program. All I am saying is that Lavrov and the Russians say that they were tricked last year. They agreed to withdraw their troops from near Kiev because they assumed that a draft agreement had almost been agreed, and the Ukrainians went back on that, and in fact the war continued, and that the Russians found that they'd withdrawn their troops in reliance upon apparent Ukrainian promises and agreements which were not fulfilled. Given that that is so, Lavrov says that Russia is not interested in a ceasefire at this time and will not agree to one. Negotiations can take place, but they can only take place in conditions where no ceasefire is taking place. Now, that in effect buries the freeze idea. And there's a number of things to say about this. Firstly, of course, at this moment in time, it is the Russians who overall are on the defensive. There are reports today that the Russians have actually made some more significant progress in the Kupiansk area, that they've advanced further in that direction. I spoke about those 2 Leopard 2 tanks that the Russians claim were destroyed in and around somewhere around Kupiansk. It's not exactly clear where. But anyway, there's been reports that the Russians are pushing forward there, and they are on the offensive in this area. But overall, we are still looking at a situation where it is Ukraine which is supposed to be mounting an offensive. Now, in that kind of situation, if Ukraine's offensive were succeeding, one would assume that the Russians would be the ones who would be pressing for a ceasefire. The fact that they are rejecting a ceasefire outright suggests that as far as the Russians are concerned, the offensive is failing. The fact that the Russians are saying that they do not agree to a ceasefire suggests that they do not believe that their hold over Crimea, over Donbass, over Zaporozhye region is being seriously challenged by Ukraine. It also suggests to me that the Russians do intend to go on the offensive, probably fairly soon. Russian men have been taking out contracts with the Russian military since the 1st of January. Last report that Putin gave was that 300,000 men have signed up for the Russian army. So, given that that is so, given that it takes the better part of a year, apparently, to train up troops, it is likely that some of those troops that started to be called up at the start of this year are now in the process of completing their training. Now, I don't know how many troops there are at that situation. I don't know how stable the enlistment process has been, but I'm going to suggest that by the end of this year, out of the 400 plus thousand men that the Russians have been enlisting this year into their contract forces, a very high proportion of these will have reached a sufficient level of training to be slowly introduced into the battlefronts. And of course, the biggest Russian arms build-up, is supposed to be taking place next year, but we know already that the Russians have cranked up production to pretty high levels. There doesn't seem to be huge amounts of evidence of very heavy Russian equipment losses. The Ukrainians claim that they've knocked out lots of Russian artillery pieces, but I'm going to suggest that artillery is about the one item that the Russians are least likely to be short of. So, given that this is so, there are probably now enough Russian troops in theatre, and new Russian troops in theatre, and enough Russian equipment to conduct some kind of offensive, probably towards the end of this year. All the indications are, however, that the big, heavy strike is going to happen at some point next year, as these 400,000 men are fully inducted and trained up and equipped for war. And again, I'm not going to try to work out the timetable. But anyway, coming back to Lavrov, his words do suggest an offensive, and I would suggest at least a preliminary offensive fairly soon, in advance of the bigger offensive that is to come. And Lavrov made it also fairly clear that the Russians do not seriously expect that this conflict is going to be settled through negotiations. He spoke about how the Western powers are basically blinded by their obsessions over Ukraine, and he said that if it has to be settled on the battlefield, well, I'm summarizing what he said now, he suggested, so be it, and that suggests that the Russians now do have a fully operational and worked out offensive plan to end the war, one which I suspect they're intending to implement next year. That's how I read Lavrov's comments. Now, I am sure that there are officials in the United States who understand this perfectly well. They can add up the numbers. They may be a little off on some of the numbers. They may be even underestimating the scale of the Russian buildup. But they cannot be oblivious to the fact that it is happening, nor can they be oblivious to the extent of the depletion of the West's arsenals and of the inability of the West to keep Ukraine re-equipped with more and more weapons, even as Ukraine burns through ammunition stocks and burns through equipment. And nor can they be oblivious to Ukraine's increasing manpower problems. There have been articles about this proliferating across the Western media. I discussed one yesterday that had been published back in July by the Jamestown Foundation, and all of the indications are that since then the manpower crisis in Ukraine has only got worse. Given that this is so, it is unsurprising that these people, who are also deeply skeptical about Ukrainian tactics, that New York Times article that I was speaking about, the one I cannot find, apparently said that one of the reasons why Ukraine's forces have become exhausted and depleted is because of Zelensky's decision, the Ukrainian general's decision to keep fighting towards Bakhmut. It suggested that for them, Bakhmut is an obsession and that has worn out the Ukrainian military even further. Well, that may be the case. Anyway, American officials in the intelligence community, in the Pentagon, are able to put all of this together, and they must be trying to explain to people like Jake Sullivan that his freeze idea simply cannot work. This is not realistic. It's not an option that will fly. And it's quite likely that Jake Sullivan, who has a completely different, entirely political agenda, one centered on elections and centered on trying to maintain the Democratic Party's position in the United States, and, by the way, his own position within the administration. It's not surprising at all if Jake Sullivan and the group around him are simply not listening. Let me say it again. The difference, the argument that's taking place within the administration, within the political wing of the administration, is not between neocons and realists. It's not between hawks and doves, to use the terminology of the Vietnam War. It is between two types of hardliners. The Sullivan Group, and if you like, the Nuland Group, but neither actually have a clear grasp of the problems that are mounting in Ukraine. And I would not be surprised if intelligence analysts who are trying to explain the gravity of the situation to the White House are becoming increasingly exasperated by the inability of the president and of his aides to see the problem, to see the emerging problem. Now, I'm going to say something else. I think that if we're talking about Jake Sullivan and other aides close to the president himself, they also have, of course, other problems as well, alongside the problem of Ukraine, that must be causing them increasing worry. I've spoken about the fact that the Russians apparently expect to be able to cover the significant increase in spending in their budget next year and run a surplus on the budget because of higher energy costs, higher energy receipts. And they may be right, we shall see. But for Sullivan, for the Democrats, the fact that oil prices, that energy prices have been steadily growing over the last few weeks, putting pressure, increasing, renewed pressure on household budgets, even after the administration had previously said that the inflation problem had been overcome, well, that is going to present significant problems in electoral terms over the course of the election next year. But there is also other problems as well. The president himself is facing multiple challenges. He's facing challenges because of this impeachment inquiry that the Republicans in the House have now launched. And of course, there are now increasing criticisms, or at least not criticisms, increasing calls for the president to agree to step aside because of his evident infirmity, which is becoming increasingly obvious. His speech at the United Nations is now agreed to have been a disappointment. There was a shambolic press conference in Hanoi. There was apparently another unsuccessful meeting. I'm not entirely sure where, but apparently it's happened in the last couple of days, in which the president apparently repeated the same anecdote almost immediately after he'd finished giving it. Now, it's also been suggested, and by the way, I should say that I've noticed that whilst the US media is generally wary of discussing this topic, the media in Britain is far less inhibited. There have been reports about this in the London Times, an increasing number in the Daily Telegraph. Anyway, it's been suggested that the president needs to step down soon, that he has only about a month to announce, or not step down, but at least step aside. He's got there's only about a month left before the primary season, the campaigning season, begins, and that he needs to, a decision as to what is to be done needs to be made over the course of the next few weeks, because otherwise it will be too late. The system will be baked in the cake, the outcome will be baked in the cake. If the president is still saying that he wants to be re-elected in a month's time, then it is highly likely that he will continue through the primary season, and despite whatever problems arise, he will continue to be the Democrats' nominee for the White House in the election next year. Now, Jake Sullivan himself and the team around the president almost certainly want to resist this pressure, because, of course, they are part of the president's team. If the president steps down or steps aside, then essentially they lose their positions in the White House. Any new president, any new Democratic nominee, assuming he or she is elected, will presumably want their own team. They will not want the president's team. So Sullivan has to think about that also. So the amount of time he's able to give to the topic of Ukraine, the amount of time the entire team is able to give to the topic of Ukraine must be reducing. It is not surprising that for Sullivan, the solution is a freeze, because for him, that is the way the problem can go away, in which case he has fewer things to think and worry about. Given this dynamic, which is not difficult to work out, it's perhaps unsurprising that when Jake Sullivan gets information or analysis from people in the intelligence community, which tell him that his desired outcome, a freeze, is not an achievable outcome, he simply doesn't want to hear it. Anyway, there we are. We are now looking at a complex situation, obviously, on the battlefronts. There are some reports that Ukraine is again thinking of trying some kind of cross-Dnieper landing. There's this grouping that's been built up on the west bank of the Dnieper in Kherson region, the so-called Omaha and Normandy group. The numbers so far don't seem to be very great, but it could be that there's now a plan to try to assemble more missiles. Partly the intention may be to try and get more missiles to support this attack, amphibious landing across the Dnieper. I'd say that with the autumn rains coming, I'm guessing now that the idea of an amphibious landing across the Dnieper is going to look increasingly difficult for that to happen, at least to me. But anyway, we will see whether any such plans really do exist and if they're implemented at all. But one way or the other, as I said, I think we can see why there would be divisions not just within the administration, between the various political parts of the administration, but between the intelligence officers, the Defense Department people, and the political leaders, be they Sullivan, Blinken, or Nuland. None of them are perhaps listening properly and are willing to respond to the emerging realities, because, as Eve Smith has pointed out so well on several occasions, these people are now mainly focused on arguing things out between themselves and are following political agendas, and their actual grasp of the actual realities on the battlefields, is probably becoming quite limited. The key words are those of Lavrov. He's rejecting the ceasefire outright. He says the Russians have been led along the garden path before, and his words suggest that some sort of big Russian offensive this autumn and a much bigger Russian offensive next year is on the horizon. Anyway, let's move on. There's been an increasingly big argument now between Canada and India over the assassination in India of this Sikh activist. Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, I've had all kinds of people contact me, many taking a strongly anti-Indian government position about the position of the Sikhs in the Punjab and about the history of this conflict. I am not myself going to discuss this in any detail. This is not a topic which I feel that I ought to discuss. I only know about it to a certain extent, and besides, it seems to me to be a domestic matter within India itself. So I'm not going to discuss that particular conflict, nor, by the way, am I going to play detective and try to work out what actually happened over the course of this incident, whether the Sikh activist really was assassinated by the Indian government, by Indian security services, or whether perhaps he was assassinated as a result of some internecine quarrel within the Khalistan movement, or whether perhaps there was some other explanation for his death. Again, I'm not going to go there. The point is that it's now clear that this incident, this quarrel over this individual, this assassination, is a bigger and more complex event diplomatically than had appeared initially to be the case. And the proof of this is a gigantic article in the Financial Times. And this article has the extraordinary title, "The West's Modi Problem." And the subtitle reads, "The US and its allies are cultivating India as an economic and diplomatic partner, but its Prime Minister's authoritarian streak is becoming harder to ignore." Now, I should say, first of all, that the Financial Times, of all of the British media journals, is the one which, in my opinion, is closest to the thinking of the United States. I get the impression that sometimes stories are actually purposefully leaked first to the Financial Times by US officials when they want to shape opinion in Europe, the Financial Times being, of course, a journal that is widely read across Europe. So, note that the article communicates the fact that the West has a Modi problem, and that, yes, the United States and the Western powers have indeed been cultivating India as an economic and diplomatic partner, but that they now have concerns about Prime Minister Modi himself. Now, that's the first thing to say about this article. The second thing to say about this article, and as I said, it's a long article, is that it avoids all discussion of US relations with China. And of course, it, I think, entirely ignores the topic of India's relations with Russia. And it does say this: India is becoming one of America's most important foreign partners as a bulwark against China. The US has invested heavily in bolstering relations with New Delhi as part of its broader strategy of enhancing relationships in the Indo-Pacific region, and partnerships spanning areas from defense and high-tech manufacturing to artificial intelligence have been developed, and Biden granted Modi the high diplomatic honor of a state dinner at the White House in June. So there is an admission about India's importance, strategic importance to the United States. There's a conspicuous unwillingness, however, in this article to discuss India's relationship with Russia. But anyway, put that aside. What we learn, however, is that relations are becoming increasingly difficult behind the scenes, behind the appearance of friendship and amity, and that already this was evident during the G20 summit. And this is what the article says. Behind the scenes, this is about the G20 summit, a conflict was brewing that within a week would escalate into an acute diplomatic crisis, alarming India's Western allies and raising fundamental questions over the image of the country curated at the summit of itself as Vishwaguru, or teacher of the world. And we learn that during the G20 summit, Modi and Trudeau held a pull-aside talk where the two leaders exchanged sharp words. And then the article reads, Modi confronted Trudeau about anti-India activities among Sikh separatists in Canada who favour creating an independent state of Khalistan in India's Punjab. These extremist elements, the words extremist elements, like the words in anti-India activities are in quotation marks, had incited violence against diplomats and missions, Modi charged, threatening the Indian community in India. And that's also in quotation marks. And then we're told that back home in Ottawa this Monday, Trudeau dropped his own bombshell into Canada-India relations by publicly announcing that Canadian intelligence had credible allegations, those words also in quotation marks, that Indian agents were involved in the assassination of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, a Sikh separatist shot dead in a Vancouver suburb in June. And we then go on to read that the Financial Times reported early on Friday that even as they were heaping praise on Modi for hosting a successful G20, Biden and other Western leaders privately raised concerns about Canada's allegations with the Indian leader during the summit. And it goes on to say that something bigger than bilateral relations between two G20 members is now at stake. The all-in geopolitical bet the United States, Britain, Australia, and other countries are making on India as a democratic ally that also opposes China. And there's an awful lot more about this and about the fact that Western governments are now having their doubts about Prime Minister Modi. Now, what are we to make of all of this? Is it really the case that the assassination of a Sikh activist in Canada could create a crisis not just between India and Canada, but between India and the entire West? Is it really justified to say that the West has a Modi problem? Well, let me first of all make a few points. Trudeau, this Financial Times suggests that Trudeau was on the receiving end of sharp words from Modi during the G20 over Sikh activists in Canada. He doesn't say who initiated the discussion. Most probably, or so it seems to me, it was Trudeau. Trudeau probably met with Modi and informed Modi that he had this information from Canadian intelligence, that the Indian security services had carried out the assassination. And as we see from the Financial Times article, it seems that Modi reacted sharply. And it also seems from the Financial Times article that other Western leaders also spoke with Modi and backed Trudeau over the course of this discussion. Now, this is unusual. I would say that normally what tends to happen when one friendly government is worried about the actions of another friendly government is that initially, at least, this is communicated through diplomatic channels before it reaches a leaders' meeting. And I'm going to suggest that Modi most probably would have seen this meeting with Trudeau as threatening, as an attempt by the Canadians, by the Western powers, to put pressure on him during the G20 summit at a time when there were fierce arguments over the G20 statement and about whether or not the G20 would include a paragraph that was in some way critical of Russian actions in Ukraine, something which the Indians were resisting, but which the West very much wanted to see. And given that I think that Modi probably saw Trudeau's actions as a threat, unsurprisingly, he pushed back, and he pushed back strongly. And the result is that it probably hardened India's position during the G20 summit and may have been another factor in producing the statement that the G20 eventually produced. But why would the Western powers have acted in this way in the first place? Well, I'm going to suggest that it wasn't just an argument about the G20 statement that is concerning Western leaders. It is the entire direction of Indian foreign policy. In the run-up to the BRICS summit, there were reports appearing in the West that Prime Minister Modi would not actually attend. But of course, he did attend. He not only attended, but he went fully along with the BRICS agenda. BRICS expansion took place. The BRICS pressed forward with the construction of their global trade and financial architecture. And Prime Minister Modi had what by all accounts was a successful meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping. So unsurprisingly, the Western powers came to the G20 summit worried and annoyed about the direction Prime Minister Modi and India was taking. And I'm going to suggest that Prime Minister Trudeau acted in the way that he did with the agreement of all of the other Western countries, not just because of concerns about this particular incident in Canada. As I said, there are other ways of raising these issues between friendly governments, but as a warning to Prime Minister Modi himself that the West was unhappy with what he was doing, and that if he continued, the West would raise a storm over it and would, in effect, attack Prime Minister Modi, start criticising Modi himself. And that is exactly what has happened. Trudeau returned to Canada. He went to the Canadian Parliament. He made these allegations against India. And now we have an article appearing in the Financial Times telling us that the West has a Modi problem and that the Prime Minister's authoritarian streak is becoming harder to ignore. And of course, when there is references to an authoritarian streak, that is partly code language for saying that Prime Minister Modi is in some way in league with the autocracies, the league of autocracies that the West is now confronting. Now, is this the end of the affair between India and the West? I don't think so. I think that still the Western powers remain concerned to try to maintain at least some kind of a relationship with India. They would not want to see India drift entirely towards the BRICS, to integrate entirely with the BRICS and to develop its relationship with China. There is this paragraph, for example, in the Financial Times article. A wider schism would also threaten India's slow move into the US orbit as tensions with China escalates. An interesting paragraph, by the way. India moving into the US's orbit, not an outcome any Indian leader would ever subscribe to. India becoming a satellite of the United States, revealing maybe, if you like, a kind of Freudian slip in this article, but it tells us a little about the kind of outlook that Western officials and Western commentators have. But then, of course, we have the concern that if this move into the US's orbit is now slowing, then we have a commentator saying this wouldn't be a good outcome at all, as for all concerned, especially against the backdrop of an increasingly assertive China in the Indo-Pacific and globally. So, concern ultimately about where India is going, but also an unwillingness maybe to break connections with India entirely, because doing so would in fact accelerate India's drift in the other direction, away from the West. Having said that, we see that the strains between India and the West are starting to increase. And let me reiterate again a point I've made many times. If so, the primary fault for this is not with India, it is with the West. This, either you are with us or against us line that the West takes with everyone eventually pushes potential friends away. India, in my opinion, the Modi government still wants to have a good relationship with the West. It wants to be friends with the West. Why wouldn't it? But it does not want to become a satellite of the West. It does not want to be drawn into the West's orbit. It wants to preserve its historic friendship with Russia. It wants ultimately to improve relations with the mighty neighbor next door, China, with which India has had a fraught relationship. And if the West comes along and says to India, you can't do these things, you must be on our side, you must join what is in effect our bloc, then the Indians will push back. And if you try to put pressure on them in the kind of way that happened at the G20 summit, with this, I suspect, very threatening conversation between Modi and Trudeau, then of course you'll push them away further still. If you read this article carefully, you sense the dismay in the West at the way in which this attempt, in my opinion, to threaten the Indians at the G20 summit has backfired. I suspect that the assumption was that Modi values his relations with the West too highly and is too concerned about his own standing to have wanted this incident of the Sikh of the assassination of the Sikh activist publicised in the way that Trudeau was threatening to do. And I think that they expected that this would cause Modi and India to fall into line. They're dismayed that this has not happened, that Modi took the stance that he did, and that the Congress Party in India and Indian opinion is supporting him. Well, anybody who knows anything at all about India would find that completely unsurprising, but I suspect that it is a long time since the experts that the United States and Britain and other Western countries have over Indian affairs, who do exist, were heeded to or listened to in any substantive way. So, a friend, potential friend, is being perhaps alienated. A war in Ukraine is being lost, and the leadership of the West continues exactly as always. Well, this is where I end my program today. We will see what Ukraine does, whether they do manage to push forward in the Orechov, Rottino, Verbovoye area, whether they do eventually try an amphibious landing across the Dnieper in the few weeks that are left before the rains and the rains come, and I suspect make any idea of such an operation, well, impossible. Well, we shall see about that. We shall see what happens with the delivery of the ATACMS and of the Taurus missiles, and we shall also see whether the relationship between India and the West is patched together or continues to deteriorate. But this is where my program today ends. I want to thank you again for joining me. Remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and before long, and also, by the way, X, the former Twitter, that you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can go to our shop and buy yourself the amazing things that you will find there. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.